Tucked away down a little lane in rural Herefordshire, there's a huge, imposing structure of a disused 1800s boarding school, now known as the George Jarvis School. The school bell rung for the last class long ago, after the Victorian Gothic style building became too expensive to maintain. But if the wealthy benefactor whose money made the school possible had had his dying wishes honoured, the George Jarvis School would never have been built in the first place. And so now, decades after the classrooms emptied out, there's rumours that the building is haunted. Allegedly, but perhaps not surprisingly, by the wealthy yet unwilling benefactor George Jarvis himself. But with the sheer amount of paranormal activity being reported from inside the sprawling building, could there be more than just George roaming around the corridors? But first of all, how on earth do you end up with a school named after you that you didn't even want built with your money? That is a very peculiar set of circumstances to find yourself in, right? I mean, technically, George himself didn't, he was already dead by then, but you know what I mean? And so the story with George Jarvis was that he was born in 1704 in Herefordshire, but in his life he moved to London and made his fortune as a leather dresser, which is someone who obviously works with leather after a hide has been tanned, and they'll colour it, polish it, just basically prepare it for what it was going to be used for. And as you'll see in a moment, when I say he made his fortune, he made a fortune. He died in 1793 and left behind one daughter, as his wife had passed away before him. But George Jarvis was seemingly not one to let bygones be bygones. He wasn't the type of man to let a grudge go very easily. And so he had actually completely cut his only daughter out of his will. The reason? She'd obviously got married, and someone in her husband's family, at some point, whether intentionally or unintentionally, had done or said something that had rubbed George up the wrong way. Whatever it was, he was personally offended, he found it very rude, and that was the reason why he'd cut his daughter Mary off from any inheritance, because he didn't want a penny going to that repulsive family. Even when, as he was writing up this will, and some associates of his were a bit like, are you sure you want to do this? Your future unborn grandchildren weren't the ones who offended you. Don't you want them to get something? Nope, stuffed a lot of them, they're not seeing a penny of my fortune. On her dad's death, Mary obviously contested this will, but it didn't pan out for her. And so, as per George Jarvis's final wishes, he left £30,000 in a trust to be invested into government securities so that the money would hopefully continue to grow by compounding interest on those investments, and then the dividends and interests from those government securities was to be used to help the poor families living in the area where he had grown up. He left £13,000 for the village of Bredwardine, £6,000 for Letton, and £11,000 for Staunton on Wye. Do you want to know how much that equates to in 2024? Just over £3.6 million. George was loaded. He'd stated, though in no uncertain terms, that the money he was leaving in trust for these villages was to be used to buy food, clothes and medicines for the poor in the community. That was it. It was absolutely not to be used to build any type of buildings. No village halls going up on his dime. Apparently, the specific line in his will reads that my mind and will is that none of the said monies be appropriated in erecting any public or other buildings whatsoever. So pretty clear cut, I'd say. And so obviously this was a super generous thing for George Jarvis to do, giving something back to the place where he'd been born. But not everyone saw it that way. Or at least it wouldn't continue to be the blessing that it had initially been. Because by 1802, the trustees, so the people left in charge of the pot of money, were reporting a problem. They were claiming that there was just too much money. They were never going to be able to spend it all if they were just buying food, clothes and medicine. Because, oh no, the investments were just doing so well that the income was always larger than the expenditure. But that also, because the poor families were being fed and clothed and they had access to medicines when they needed it, there was no reason for them to work at bettering their own situation. And then basically all this money was doing was, quote, promoting idleness. It would take another 50 years though for anything to be done about it, when in 1852, the pot had apparently grown to £100,000, which is a little over £11 million today. And at that point, the trust was modified by a chancery decree. So basically, where a court can decide to overrule someone's will and change the terms of the trust. And so this chancery decree stated that George Jarvis's money could be used for more than just the food, clothes and medicine. I bet his daughter, Mary, would have just been fuming at this point. Like, I don't know if she was still alive by then, but I'm gonna guess probably not. But that's gotta be such a slap in the face, right? But there were a bunch of different things that they could now use the money for. The trust began to be used to pay the salary of a medical officer, as well as his house in the local area to live in, but they also set up almshouses, which would give the poorest of the poor a roof over their heads, because I guess it's not the most ideal to be fed, clothed and healthy if you don't actually have a home to live in. But the money was also used to set up an educational foundation to provide schooling to, again, the children of these poor families. And as part of that educational foundation, the building of a brand new school in Staunton-on-Wye. It was initially designed to be a boarding school for those poor children who otherwise wouldn't have received an education. So I mean, it's still benefiting the people who George Jarvis had intended to help, but it went directly against his specific wishes. Do not use this money to build anything. They started construction in 1859, and by 1862, the school, known then as World's End Lodge, was ready to shape those little minds of the future. The first headmaster, Mr. Frederick Ramsay, he'd moved there with his family from Middlesex, and he was apparently a great headmaster. He was always dressed for the occasion, always wearing a top hat and frock coat, very fashionable for the time. From the get-go though, a lot of people were a little confused, shall we say, because they couldn't understand why such a huge boarding school had been built. Like, yeah, there was a need for educating the poor in the area, but not so high that they needed to build Staunton-on-Wye's very own Hogwarts, you know? Either way, it's too late, it's been built now. The school catered to both boys and girls, and it had an infant school, so taking kids from that preschool age and then the primary school, so onwards up until like 11-ish years old. In 1881, the school got a library and study room, and then a few decades later, in 1913, they did up the interior, got some new furniture and bits and bobs, and this was also the year that they opened up the school to kids older than 11, so I guess it's now kind of your secondary school as well, where they teach the boys things like handiwork and general country rural life skills, and then they taught the girls homemaking and gardening, as well as a bit of English and science. In 1919, the school actually had a diphtheria outbreak, which is an incredibly infectious bacterial disease that affects your respiratory system. It causes a fever, sore throat, and this weird thick grey membrane to form in your throat and nose, which can make it difficult to breathe and swallow. But it also can be life-threatening. And at that point, the vaccine wasn't even available yet, so it was quite concerning and spread through the school pretty badly. Luckily, the school nurse was quoted as saying that the outbreak was unusually mild, and so it looks like they didn't lose any children during this outbreak. Wow, it's not often that I get to say something that's bordering on positive when no one died during a story, is it? That's great, we'll take that as a win for today. However, what wasn't so great for the school was that in this same year, 1919, the boarding school part of the operation closed down. It had never been successful. In the almost 60 years that it had been going, it had barely been used. It was hideously undersubscribed. It was just way too big for the needs of the community at the time. The World's End Lodge continued to be used as a normal day school though for the kids. However, during World War II, as was the case for big buildings all over the country, it looks like the British military were camped here for a while, after which American troops moved in for a bit, and then potentially after that there were some sources that said it became a military hospital as well. And there was a big allegedly that I came across, as one source claimed that one night while the Americans were sleeping, one soldier opened a window, climbed through, and jumped to his death. No names, no dates, so pinch of salt, sprinkle of skepticism, this is just what I came across. After the war, the school was still in use, but over time it had obviously scaled down until it was only catering for the younger kiddos in the area. And then in May 1963, the Youth Hostels Association, YHA, they leased part of the building to open up a youth hostel at World's End Lodge. And if you don't know, a YHA hostel is basically a place for reasonably priced accommodation, primarily targeted at obviously younger people, young families, people like that. And they say that they're more than just a place that you'll crash out at the end of the day. They usually offer outdoor pursuits, things like hiking, canoeing, mountain biking, all that good stuff in the fresh air. By the 60s, the building was in dire need of some TLC, so the YHA volunteers put in the work. They obviously had to create dormitories for their guests to stay in. They installed a warden's kitchen, sorted the plumbing, electrics, and then you need to actually make it look nice, so redid all the interior decorating too. And the hostel operated for a good few years, but World's End Lodge, she's a big building. Gotta keep up with that upkeep. But it was just a bit too much for the YHA at that point, so on the 31st of December 1982, their lease was terminated. They gave it another go in 1987 when one of the YHA canoe instructors, who had previously been based at the hostel, he took the building on along with his wife. They ran the hostel again for a few years until it stopped being a YHA hostel in 1990 and ceased to be a hostel altogether in 1993. And all this time, the Staunton-on-Wye primary school had still been there on the property. But you know, the building is over 100 years old by this point. It's huge. It's unnecessary for what it's being used for. And so a new primary school was built not too far away, which took over from World's End Lodge in 2010. And that was that for a few years. The Jarvis Trust sold the building in 2015, and from what I can tell, it just stood empty. And what do we know eventually happens when big old beautiful buildings like this one are empty for an extended period of time? Vandals get in and try to wreck the place. Smashed windows, graffiti, even attempted arson. Like seriously, just what is wrong with people? But thankfully, in 2020, the Grade 2 listed building got a new lease of life. As spectacular ghost hunting events, they started to lease the school, which was now starting to be known as the George Jarvis School, obviously alluding to the very unwilling benefactor whose money paid for the building. And nowadays, you can book onto a ghost hunt at the school and go exploring over the 4 floors of 40 rooms. They've got outbuildings, like the lot. And if you sit more on the hardcore skeptic side of the fence, you may be leaning back in your chair right now, chortling to yourself, as yes, the paranormal is a revenue stream for the building, which can then be used to help maintain and preserve it. So I get where your head is at. It does seem a little bit too convenient. But apparently, the idea of ghost hunting didn't just spontaneously come out of nowhere. There's a lot of people out there who truly believe that this place is haunted, and had that opinion way before Spooktacular got involved. There was a story going as far back as when the American soldiers were stationed at the school, where allegedly some of them were sleeping, and in the middle of the night they started to hear bricks falling down the chimney. And I mean, we're in the early 40s, the building would have been a little worse for wear by this point. Maybe it was a particularly windy night, maybe bricks were just falling off and coming down the chimney. What might make the whole situation a little bit creepier though, is that they started to hear disembodied footsteps walking along the corridor outside the room. Thing was, everyone was accounted for, there shouldn't have been footsteps heard outside their room. Again, may have just been the old building making old building noises, but as the footsteps were right outside their room, surely that would have been a little harder to mistake, right? Not impossible, but just interesting. But it affected these soldiers so much that they refused to sleep in that room again, and it was from then on called the haunted room. That's how terrified these men had been that night. And then even after the soldiers were stationed here, the kids also knew something was up with their school. Past students and even staff who worked there have allegedly experienced weird things. Everything from objects moving on their own without any explanation, through to even seeing apparitions. One that's talked about a lot is that a pair of disembodied legs were witnessed walking down one of the school's corridors, but we don't know who these legs belong to. Some believe that the legs might be those of the school's most famous ghostly resident, George Jarvis himself. Because even though he should have been resting in peace for almost 60 years by the time his trust was changed slightly, he's said to stalk the building, absolutely outraged, incensed that his money is being used in a way that goes directly against his wishes. And I mean, with the way he cut his daughter out of his will, we can see that this man is no stranger to harbouring not insignificant levels of resentment. Was this blatant disrespect of his last will and testament enough to rouse him from beyond and compel him to forever voice his disgust at the abomination that is this building? Apparently so, as his apparition has been seen walking that same corridor where these legs were spotted. So maybe the legs as well could have been him, I don't know. But locals have also allegedly witnessed an old man who is said to look very angry, and he appears looking out of the top floor window. Other people who have been investigating the school have claimed that they've heard an angry, almost aggressive male voice shout at them to get out. So I mean, you can follow the logic of it being George Jarvis, right? But just bear in mind, with the man walking through the corridors, even maybe the legs, looking out the window, shouting at ghost hunters, this building did not exist while George Jarvis was alive. I'm not saying it isn't him, not saying that the ghostly man walking down the corridors isn't the same man who paid for the school and thought he may as well check out what his money paid for, but it does just, I guess, make you think. At least it does for me. Maybe it could even be a former teacher or headmaster, another male presence that could have been maybe quite unkind to the kids perhaps while he was here. Because we do have to remember the school in the context of its heyday. Corporal punishment, caning students, was common. There aren't any specific records, but maybe some teachers were a bit more overzealous with the use of said corporal punishment on their students, because there is actually a ghost story that allegedly comes from the punishment of one of these kids. Apparently, one of the punishments involved locking the misbehaving student up in the bell tower. There's no specific record on who the student is, or even if anything actually happened to this particular student, but now it's said that a young boy has been seen wandering around that area, and the disembodied voices of children have been heard. I did see this one story that said that this particular boy actually hung himself in the bell tower, and that from then on the anniversary of his death, the bell tower rope turns red with this boy's blood. Which, I don't know, it just seems a little bit too wild for me to take seriously. I'm sorry. Present the evidence that a student actually did that in the bell tower, I might put a little bit more stock in it, but I don't know. It's sounding a bit too much like a creepy ghost story that you share around a campfire at night, you know? But even if that isn't what happened, so many people report seeing this figure of a young boy up there in that area. And there is also another entity that's witnessed around the grounds of the George Jarvis School. It's another man, and he's been spotted riding his horse around the grounds. I'm sorry, she's being really distracting today. I feel like I've got fur like all over over my face. What's up? And this is Bean, by the way. This isn't Lucy, who it normally is. I've definitely got cat hair on my face. Are you shedding all over me? The story goes that this guy was a foreman called Daniel Jones, who was overseeing building the school and the almshouses. And on the 7th of April, 1860, as Daniel was riding home from the local watering hole, the Portway Inn, after an evening of refreshments to round off a hard day's work managing the construction, he fell from his horse and broke his neck. Daniel lingered for a few days before finally succumbing to his injuries on the 11th of April 1860, aged 44, meaning that he never got to see the project finished. He was buried in the local graveyard, but potentially he never stopped looking out for the school, even in death. And there is talk of yet another male entity allegedly haunting the building, this time down in the cellars. A ghost hunter's favourite spot because they're just so bright and airy and relaxing spaces, aren't they? Apparently, this one is a religious man. In life, he was a man of the cloth, but he's thought to be responsible for the horrible feelings that people get when they venture down there. Some people have reported being grabbed by something that they can't see, or they'll just get an overwhelmingly unnerving feeling that they just have to get out of there. They can't cope. And I mean, I can understand it, even from a real world perspective. Cellars, being underground, that can give anyone that anxiety feeling, right? But apparently it could be more than that. There are some stories that teachers would convene down here, but they wouldn't talk about what they got up to, whether they were partying, doing whatever, we don't really know. There are loads of champagne bottles down here now, so it looks like someone did have a good old knees up at some point, and some locals are adamant that the cellar was actually used as a brothel after the school shut down in 2010 once it was abandoned, so there's that too. But in reality, we don't really know one way or the other, and where this alleged clergyman actually comes into the story. But those aren't the only areas of particular interest to ghost hunters at the George Jarvis School. The bathrooms are allegedly quite active, with taps turning on and off without any explanation. The staircase, be on the lookout around there, as some people have felt the feeling of being pushed while they're walking down the stairs. Other people have seen objects being moved on their own, papers ripped off the displays of the walls when there's no one even near that area. Doors have sometimes been known to open and slam, with some hearing scratching at the door too, but when you look out there, there's nothing there, no animal that's found its way inside or anything. People also said that it's not just the slamming of the door itself, because, I mean, you can explain that one away, can't you? Big old drafty buildings. But when you hear these loud bangs or doors slamming, it's apparently always accompanied by a feeling of cold dread that overwhelms you, puts you totally on edge, no matter how skeptical you are of what you just heard. A baby's cries have also been heard, which, in an old building like that, probably isn't the place where anyone would take a baby, so it's a very weird sound to be hearing there, right? But the same could be said for the echoing sounds of a piano being played when there isn't a piano in the building, or the landline phones ringing when there aren't any, let alone any that are connected. The old school bell will also just sometimes ring by itself for absolutely no reason and at random times. People report encountering the sensation like someone they can't see is pulling at their clothes. Strange white mists have been seen materializing and disappearing throughout the building, and even dogs will sometimes have a strong reaction to something in the school. They'll start barking and howling and refuse to enter certain rooms, like they're sensing something that you definitely can't see. Because while school may be out forever at the George Jarvis School, it definitely seems like the building is far from completely unoccupied, but by the angry, restless spirit of George Jarvis himself. That point is an interesting one to chew on, and not how I thought this story was going to go at all. When I started researching this one, I was sure that I was going to come across some talk of the ghost of the generous, benevolent George Jarvis, and he was going to be wandering the halls of the school that he helped to create because he was such a kind, charitable man who just wanted to give back to the less fortunate in the community in any way that he could. And apparently that's just not the case at all, is it? I mean, I'm not going to belittle the good that he actually did for the community. He helped the poorest in the area with food, clothes, medicines, and although not intentionally, he inevitably helped with shelter and schooling too. I'm not going to take that away from him. What he did was a good thing, regardless of the fact that the trustees in 1802 didn't see it that way. He really didn't deserve to be branded as the infamous George Jarvis and his notorious charity. He could have left it to his family instead, or even a mate in London, and then the community wouldn't have seen a penny. But he didn't. He helped the poor, complaining about having too much money. But if he really was like the way that he was described, with effectively holding a grudge against his daughter that cut her off from any of her dad's money, that is a petty streak that runs deep. Clearly he likes things just so, does not take kindly to disrespect. So what's more disrespectful than basically rewriting someone's will and using their hard-earned money in ways that they explicitly said not to use it in? That level of disrespect, is that enough to bring someone back from their eternal peaceful rest and lead them to be haunting the building that they were so against? Makes you think. But aside from George Jarvis himself, it is entirely plausible that this school is haunted. I could see it, just from the fact that it is an old building, it's seen lots of history. But equally, I can also see that if even just the majority of the time, it's people's imagination running away with them. Just looking looking at the exterior of the school, it looks like it should be a Disneyland haunted mansion or something. It's huge, it's Gothic, and it's not in the most pristine of shape. Shadows might be falling in weird ways through the building, old faulty electrics causing the school bell to go off, plumbing past its best, turning taps on and off. What I'm getting at is I can see both sides of the argument. Not mentioning the fact that with any venue that makes a chunk of income from the paranormal, you've always got that in the back of your mind that you're thinking about the stories themselves. Like, are they just being hyped up to sell ghost hunting tickets? I'm looking at you specifically, boy in the bell tower with the bloody rope that appears on the anniversary of his death. Because from what I could see, no one actually knows who this boy is or even when or if he died. So how do we know the anniversary and when the blood appears? So for me, bottom line, I think I'm cautiously optimistic that there is something going on here. I'm more inclined to believe it's got something to do with the people who used the building throughout its lifetime. So like students, teachers, maybe even hostel staff and people like that. But equally, I do reserve a lot of skepticism for the George Jarvis School just based on the stories I've found. But I'd love to have more people come forward. If you've stayed there like while it was a hostel and experienced weird things, that would be super compelling. But regardless, tell me your thoughts if you've visited here, if you've never heard of it before, if you've been on a paranormal investigation here and you've had an experience. Do you think I've got this completely wrong and you know without a shadow of a doubt that George Jarvis haunts this school? Or have you encountered something so undeniably paranormal that you could never be convinced that this place wasn't haunted? Or is it all just to sell tickets? Tell me all of the things, all of the opinions, I want to hear them. And please also do like this video if you've enjoyed it and subscribe if you haven't already, I really do appreciate it. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. It's a pretty clear cut. So pretty clear cut